It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. The Honourable Harjit Sajjan was elected a bit over 3 months ago in the riding of Vancouver South. He's a new Member of Parliament, but he has got a really incredible history and career path. Not only was he a police officer, but he was a regimental commander, did several tours in Afghanistan. He picked up a particular nickname, which I think is going to help him around the cabinet table. To prove how battle-hardened he is offered to take questions from the audience, which is pretty impressive. So, without further ado, and with an interest in moving the program along, would you please join me in welcoming the Minister of National Defence, Harjit Sajjan.
Great, thank you for the opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege to be here in front of all of you. Any one of you can be standing up here giving the closing remarks. And it's absolutely a privilege. And the reason I say it's a privilege, because many of you who I know, who have actually helped shape a lot of my work that I have been able to do. And I know some of you who are sitting out there who had great conversations. So first of all, I just want to say thank you for your guidance, and thank you for the great conversations that has allowed me to be shape my focus. And I'm going to be talking about a few things, which some of you might have heard me repeat many times. But I'm going to put it into a context of my new portfolio that I have been given the absolute privilege and honor to hold. And I just want to say is my history, yes, I've been a police officer. Yes, I've been in the military. And everything that I do is about, when I look at our men and women in uniform, I look at them, they serve Canada. And even though I served alongside them, it's now my opportunity to serve them. And that's how I move forward. So I had, again, a great opportunity last night to meet some of you, and had a great conversation with Dr. Fareed Zakaria. And I apologize for monopolizing a lot of his time, because we really got into the weeds of many conversations there. And it was actually truly a great conversation and a privilege. And I'm kind of share with you what I was kind of talking to him about last night. So next slide, please. So the ripple effect. Every single one of you, in your capacities as business leaders, in your political careers, in any other profession you might have, we all create ripples. And we need to understand the ripple that we create has an impact. And this is what has fascinated me since the time I put on a uniform. I said, how did this happen? Some people call it a butterfly effect, but I just want to keep it very, very simple. That when us, as governments, as individuals, as companies, or an act of terrorism, they all create ripples. And we need to understand those ripples. But more importantly, we may not be able to control all the ripples that are out there, but we can control the ripples that we create. And as a government, as a Minister of National Defence, I want to make sure that we understand the ripples that we create. Because, next slide, please. We have to understand it, if you can see that slide, in a very complex environment. And I'm not going to go into minutiae of that slide. That slide is about 3 months of not just a simple link analysis. That is a social fabric of Kandahar province in 2009 over a 3-month period. To understanding who's linked to who, how do the criminal networks connect with the political sphere? How do the various organizations that are there, the non-government organizations, United Nations even, their actions and how they connect with one another? How do we in the military connected at that time? That is a true situational awareness. So when we look at the decisions that we make, the policies that we create, we have to figure out what ripple we're creating because we're putting it into that. So I challenge you, as I'm challenging myself, is that not only we need to understand, if we want to understand the ripple that we are going to be creating, we need to understand the environment that we're going to be creating it in. So for the last 10 years, we have to really do a hard assessment. Should we be patting ourselves on the back? And I'm talking from a security perspective around the world. I think we can say things have not gotten much better. Things have gotten worse. So have our decisions, and not just us. And by the way, this is not actually a criticism of the previous government. I'm talking this from a global context with our coalition partners. And I've had these conversations at the U.S. State Department when I was advising for them. Have we made the right decisions when we created that policy? Did we have an understanding that we made that policy? Understand the ripple effect at the tactical level? And to be able to understand those little clues that happen at the lowest level, how it can have a ripple effect up to the top, to the strategic level. I'll give you just one example. And I've said this many times before, this should not be a surprise. Is that some of our development strategies of the coalition partners early on in Afghanistan helped create the corruption that fueled the insurgency. We all know this about the companies that were created and so forth. But we also have to realize is, when we saw those clues of corruption at the lowest level, what action did we take, or did we say, no, it's too small? If we had taken action at those early days, could we have prevented a U.S. surge having to go in? And I'm not going to get into the minutia of this, but the answer is yes. So now, as we move forward, looking at the threats around the world, as our new government looks at this threat, we as a nation need to get better at getting a situational awareness, is something how we term it in the military. Some people call it the ground truth. Some people just call it understanding the social fabric of our society. If you live long enough into a certain area, you understand what's going on, whether it's the Ukraine, whether it's what's happening in Egypt right now, and Dr. Zakaria talked a lot about that, and what's happening in Iraq and in Syria. And that not just looking at it in isolation. How do those issues within those various countries, and even if you understand the social fabric of the society, how does it connect to the regional issues? Because as a commander on the ground force commander in Iraq right now had said in my conversation with them, today we are dealing with the son of Al-Qaeda. If we don't get the next piece right, and the next piece is not the military piece, it's that political piece, we will be dealing with the grandson of Al-Qaeda. And any of you who have worked in the Global Futures Forum, and especially back in 2007, this conversation we had this conversation. So what really disappointed me at that time was the wonderful conversation that we had. It didn't reach up to that political level to be able to say, we know that Al-Qaeda, as most organized crime groups or even terrorist organizations evolves, they always fracture off. It's almost a staple that happens. One will go this way, one will go more extreme, one will go a little bit modern, and the other one we may want to continue. That's just normally how it works. The issues of climate change, of creating grievances in many different parts of the world. Not a big deal when you talk about climate change on isolation. But put it into an area of Africa or Syria, which caused those grievances when the cost of food started to go up and people started to complain. All they wanted to do was listen to. That was that little clue. But instead of us looking at those little clues, because we're looking at a strategic level, we missed out those clues. I believe it was the protest that happened, the spray paint on the wall. And then that one action created that ripple that resulted in what we see today. So now, as we analyze the past, could we have analyzed certain portions of the clues where we as nations who are now looking at a coalition coming together to fight a threat, could we have looked at maybe a different type of engagement to prevent this crisis from getting bigger? The decisions in Libya, the decisions in Iraq. One thing I have known for certain, find me a crisis of this magnitude where coalitions need to be put together, I will find you a grievance which started it all. I think I even found the original grievance from Afghanistan that might have even prevented from another coalition having to be put together after the great work that the U.S. had done after 9/11, which was needed. And I've had these great conversations at the U.S. State Department when I was a special security advisor, not only to the U.S. State Department, but also to the U.S. military at that time. So I'm not saying anything new here. So I get questions a lot about op impact. And why aren't you coming up with a plan? I want to make sure that I have a good understanding of the situational awareness of what we're getting into, so that our contribution to the coalition is meaningful. And sometimes the contribution may not be with a stick. Regrettably, in Iraq, the stick is needed. But that stick will only buy you time to figure out the real problem, what is out there. What caused this issue? And again, Dr. Zakaria gave a wonderful explanation. I mean, the example he talked when he talked about Mosul. And we can even get into many other examples as well. A radical organization, a small group, they're looking for grievances to take advantage of alienation, a disenfranchisement, to go in and say, no one else is helping you, we will. Do you think people who are destitute are going to care what the ideology of an organization is? When somebody is coming along and making sure that there might be food at the table, justice is being served. This is the same reoccurring theme of what we saw in Afghanistan. And the reason I'm using this as an example because I lived that, but it's the same everywhere else. And this example, by the way, is something I've seen in organized crime. So we look at these groups from a terrorist perspective, but the reason I was successful in Afghanistan is because I looked at it from an organized crime network perspective. Once I realized to stop looking at the Taliban at this ideology group, that it was about money and power and grievances and this few small group up at the top who did not care to be negotiated with, are taking advantage of the situation below and allowing the population and sucking them into the fold. And this is a reoccurring theme everywhere. So I want to make sure that we get this right. And that's why I went into the region twice. That's why not only am I talking to my political counterparts, I'm talking to experts. I'm talking to the experts right here in Canada, within global affairs, within national defense, within CEDA. And believe it or not, myself, Minister Dion, and Mr. Bibo have been talking regularly, as our departments have been working together regularly on coming up with our contribution to Operation Impact, to making sure that our contribution, when it goes in, it has the package, not just coming in alone, but that's going to create the ripple for the coalition that's going to contribute to that fight. That's why we've been making sure that we spend the time to get this right, so that we create that ripple that's going to eventually lead to some positive outcomes. Unfortunately, there's a lot of work to be done even after that. Not just in that region, in Iraq and Syria. We need to start looking wider into the region. We need to look at Africa. We need to ask ourselves the question about the youth bulge in Africa and the disparity between the poor and the dictatorship and the consequences of that. And the consequences also of certain business decisions within this nation. How does it impact security in the area? I think we as a nation have great opportunity here to give this. Having a good understanding of working in collaboration, as if we as ministers are communicating and working together. Well, this could be an example for our coalition partners. And this leads to the next step, the defense review. Now, this defense review, as I was talking, will take into account, well, first of all, I will say my goal is to have it completed by the end of this year. It needs to be credible. It needs to be relevant. And my staff right now is working on a plan of how we're going to, how the process is going to unfold. Because we need to make sure it's broad and it's comprehensive, that it's not made in a silo. Not only are we going to be discussing with other departments, we're going to be talking with all of you. We're going to be engaging the public. We're going to be talking to our coalition partners. We will be looking at our most important commitments in NORAD, our commitment within NATO, and our commitment to our coalition partners, wherever it might be. So that defense review, we're going to make sure it's not just done in isolation. It's going to make sure it's synced in with where Canada is going, how within our foreign policy, within our development. It's going to be working well. Now, if we get this right, the first thing we should do is get an understanding so we can say, this is where force is needed. Well, here's a security issue, but maybe we could prevent this recruitment and this radicalization with some development work. I'm simplifying something extremely complex, but we need to get this right because we have to now go back to where I started with. Have we been getting this right? So I think if we take the time to making sure that we synchronize properly and get our ripples correct, that we can actually have a positive impact. The last thing we want to be able to go in, and I've seen this before, where work has gone, initiatives have gone into certain areas, in crisis areas. People have left, pat themselves on the back, didn't even realize the great work that they thought they did has actually created a negative ripple because, in a rudimentary example, built a well in the wrong place and upset this person, which upset that person, and it destabilized a certain village. Small little example, but these are the grievances of how it goes. These are the ripple effects that are created. So, as part of the defense review, we'll be talking procurement. Not how to fix a procurement, that is going to be something separate, but we're going to be how procurement is going to be prioritized. So our defense review, we can easily be able to say, this is will be our priorities. But as we look at procurement and the defense review and moving forward, and it includes space, cyber, 10 to 20 years, what space and cyber may look like, we can't forget our most important asset in all of everything that we're doing. And that's what I started with, is our men and women in uniform. So we need to make sure they have the right training, that they're looked after. We need to make sure that their families are looked after. Because I think every single one of us in this room know, regardless of what position you may hold, and even myself, I have to go home and move right after this. If the situation at home is not going well, it's difficult to concentrate on your job. And we ask a lot of our men and women in the Canadian Armed Forces. I get asked a lot myself of saying, oh, it must be hard to be away from your family, traveling back and forth from Vancouver. I said, you know what? I have nothing to complain about. Right now, I have men and women all over the world away from their families. I have nothing to complain about. Now, when all this comes into place with the defense review, this is what will lead to an agile force, where our men and women will have the right capability, the right training, with the right guidance as a nation that will give them to making sure that they can respond to Canada's needs, NATO's needs, and our coalition's needs, and be able to provide the security that Canadians deserve and trust. Thank you very much. I'm good.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Minister. I'm sure there's not a single question in here, is there? There are microphones. Situational analysis. I wish there was some situational analysis. I wish people listened to Colin Powell when he said, you break it, you own it. Because I think a lot of people are wishing that they would have taken his counsel back in 2002, 2003. First microphone.
Thank you. Minister, as a former ambassador to Iraq and a great admirer of the work being done by our men and women on the ground, both in the governmental and non-governmental areas, especially our men and women in uniform. And as you yourself have already been in the Middle East and seen for yourself the challenges there, I'd like to ask, pending the outcome of the review, to be available hopefully by the end of the year, what are you and without asking you to break cabinet confidentiality, what is being done now to assist our men and women in uniform to play the roles that we're asking them to play, ever more complicated, not just in terms of delivering force, but also working in conflict prevention, conflict resolution. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here today and taking questions.
Great. Thank you very much, ma'am, for that question, and thank you for your service as well. You bring up a really good point. Our men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces are not just about carrying a gun and delivering might, bringing force to a problem. Our experience, not just in Afghanistan, but if you go back, Bosnia, Cyprus, in Egypt, we don't just bring a gun to the fight. Our men and women, regardless of rank, have the ability to think differently, and it's very difficult to describe, and I've been asked this question a lot, is what makes Canadian men and women in uniform different? It's the social fabric of our society that allows us to look at one another. So when they go in, they realize that, I'll give it an example. Early in 2006, a sergeant came up to me and said, there was ambushes along a highway. And he said, he's a section commander, infantry section commander from the PPCLI. And he goes, we've been trying to send troops in there and it's not working. We're getting ambushed all the way from Kandahar Airfield and into the city. And it was daily, it was quite rough. RPGs coming in, we'd send companies, snipers, nothing was working. And he goes, there's a used car lot that's close by, and the cars get damaged. Maybe we can go in and have build some rapport and have a conversation. I heard you did some policing work, and can you guide us on how to do this? So I said, of course, let's go. So he didn't know the type of work that I was doing, so I went with him, and he led the conversation. And me being there, he started this conversation of trying to build rapport. And through that, what we realized was the owner of that car lot was cousins with a very influential person. So when now I was working on security checkpoints, police checkpoints along the way, and we put one close to that car lot. And I said, go back to him and said, you talk to your superiors, who talked to the general, and said, we were worried about your used, the cars that are being damaged. We're putting a security checkpoint right here. What we did was, by putting that security checkpoint, was to be able to build rapport with the influential person who had control of the area. And literally, and this is not an exaggeration, with some other subtle conversation, with a wave of a hand, ambushes were stopped overnight. And this is no exaggeration whatsoever. So that mindset is very important. Now take that mindset of people in uniform working at different ministries, talking about development, our CIMIC operators. They have a different mindset. We know that in conflict environments where NGOs and at times or other government officials cannot come to because of the security threat, they can go in and set the groundwork for that government and developmental work. They do this very well, and they're doing this right now because most of the conversation, believe it or not, when you're in uniform in a threat environment, is more about focusing on the other aspects of trying to help. Thank you.
Peggy Mason from the Rideau Institute. Thank you very much, Minister, for your candid comments. Before getting to my main point, I might just say with respect to the review, I'm sure it was just an oversight that you didn't mention that you would be looking at and talking to the UN, since, of course, your mandate letter includes, we at the Rideau Institute were very happy to see that, re-engagement in UN peacekeeping. So
I got many, I could turn that into another speech if you like.
Exactly. But what I want to get to is something that that you highlighted quite correctly, and that was that the use of force, the stick, as you said, only buys time to address the underlying political problems driving the conflicts. And you use this term, music to my ears, the political peace in Iraq. So that's all to the good. Yet, yesterday when we had Minister Dion here, and he was outlining just very loosely the possible plan that the government will be bringing forward to address the Iraq and Syria conflict, he spoke only of military training, possibly police training, and humanitarian support. In other words, he said nothing about what you have just described to us, and which I agree with, as being fundamental, and that is efforts to support the governance, to address the governance deficits in Iraq, that without which the police training will go nowhere, and also supporting the peace process in Syria, without which the military peace will ultimately be futile.
So our question?
Yes. So square the circle for me, please. In other words, can you give us a hint, perhaps, that the new plan will include addressing the political peace? Thank you.
No, thank you for the question, and I can assure you that Minister Dion is looking at the wider piece, just because we have these discussions together. What we're looking at, when we look at, and even though I've talked about the wider piece, we have to, if we're talking about Iraq, we have to assess the current situation, what's going on. Certain aspects of, even from the governance, if we applied certain things, will it work right now? And so what you will see is our assessment of the current situation, but this does not mean that this is the end. This is the start of reassessing of when to bring in certain capabilities. And when I talk about capabilities, I'm not talking military alone. And it has to be phased in, and by being on the ground, I got to see exactly what type of capabilities are required. And Minister Dion is actually doing a considerable amount of work on this. That governance piece, we also have to take a look at is if we bring it in at the wrong time, it may not have the impact. You have to set the conditions for it. But also, it's not just strictly within Iraq. It's a regional issue. And I can assure you, there's a lot of work that's also being done behind the scenes, as most of you know, as a lot of the work in diplomacy does. And him and his department is working very hard on that. Thank you.
I think we have time for two more quick ones.
Okay,
Is that good?
sure.
Please
Hi.
ask a question now.
You bet. I just wanted to drill down a bit and perhaps push a little bit further on a question that was asked earlier on this afternoon in regard to our refugee policy. And I guess it's understood that we have a system based on points related to vulnerability, but it's also kind of understood that there's a single med need not apply system. So based on everything we know about radicalization and vulnerability, and something that you sort of touched on just now, I was wondering if you could comment on any potential dangers you see in excluding single, unattached men in our refugee policy, and what message does this give to them, and what options does this leave for them?
No, it's, I think Mr. McCallum has actually been very clear about this, and Mr. Public Safety. As we looked at the security apparatus of bringing in 25,000 refugees, we wanted to look at the most vulnerable, because that makes sense, right? We had to be cognizant of the security needs, making sure that everybody went through a proper security process. So it never was that any one group is going to be excluded. Just that if there was an issue within a file, it's going to be put aside to making sure that the most vulnerable get access to it. So it's not being excluded, it's just going to take a little bit longer for it.
Okay, last question.
Thank you very much for being here. My question basically is, in the past, Canada has dabbled in digital diplomacy. Do you feel that digital diplomacy adds value to Canada's national security, and will we expand upon what we have done in the past on digital diplomacy?
Sorry, digital diplomacy?
Yes.
Can you just expand on that a little bit so I get a good
Sure,
context?
definitely. In the past, Canada set up a kind of online digital forum to allow countries such as Iran and members of those countries to kind of debate in a safe zone where they can communicate to each other without being blocked by their government. And I was wondering if Canada can maybe continue to lead that efforts in digital diplomacy and engaging with countries around the world that may not have that freedom through online tools?
I think the first step is making sure that we have communication with countries. Even when we may disagree on things, having a dialogue so that we can say we disagree is also very important. So that's the first step towards that. In terms of digital diplomacy, I see where you're going with it, and frankly, I think it's a great idea. I think a lot more work that needs to be done with that, because I think the next generation, not just here in North America, but around the world, view information differently, and how they communicate. It's not just about what's happening here, it's about what's happening around the world. Unfortunately, there are certain regimes that have a clampdown on things, and I think it's important to encourage that open conversation. But we can't start that open conversation if there is no way to communicate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you very much, Minister.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Anita.